All right, a bit of late mail on that last episode about the balanced compounds. Found this example in one of the old trade magazines. It's an early coal balanced compound type, and it illustrates the placement of the two inboard high pressure cylinders up on the pilot deck. By way of segue, if we look across the fold, there's an article on today's locomotive about it having the biggest boiler ever built. Today's locomotive is moored, or old moored depending on your point of view. It's a reference to a comic strip mule that was popular at the time. Moored's name is referenced in the literature, such as Swingel's Evolution of the American Steam Locomotive. He calls it old moored, but he wrote his book looking back on the history of steam. The trade literature at the time called her moored, a contemporaneous view. Examining moored's place in history means that we also need to look at the Santa Fe 210-2 types, not purely because I have this outstanding photograph, but because moored overtook the Santa Fe types as the biggest, most powerful locomotive. There's also the fact that the Santa Fe 210-2s and moored were used by their respective road effectively as extra muscle to get heavy loads over problematic grades. The technology used on moored was nothing new. What was new was the adoption of that European technology into a North American context and its use on a massive scale. 1904, when moored rolled out into traffic, is smack bang in the middle of that decade where North American types outstripped their contemporaries in other jurisdictions in terms of size and power, etc. By way of example, if we go back a couple of decades, the NZGR imported these locomotives from Baldwin, even taking into account the narrow gauge and the light axle loading of the day. They compare reasonably well to their North American counterparts. Fast forward a couple of decades and there is no contest. Due to moored being the first example of her type on North American rails, we have the benefit of a paper prepared by the road and by Alco as manufacturer, and that paper provides us with a window into the design philosophy that informed the locomotive. So here we go with that philosophy. The wheel arrangement 0660 places all of the locomotive weight onto the drivers, therefore it has a massive adhesive weight. The absence of a leading truck is explained by the designers as not being necessary because effectively that lead engine is a large radial truck. Now that needs to be unpacked because history teaches us that the 0660 and the later and larger 0880 types did not endure, and that subsequent compound articulated locomotives out on road service required the leading trucks. When a locomotive hits a curve, the flange of the leading outside wheel comes up against the rail, and that rail exerts a force against the flange. And if we can imagine a curved section of railway, the outside rail and the inside rail orbit the same point, but the outside rail covers a greater distance. If we can imagine the profile of a railway wheel, we can see that it has a taper. And what happens in a cornering context is the flange of the outside wheel rides up against the outside rail so that the greater diameter can cover the greater distance. The inside flange moves away from the inside rail so that the lesser diameter can cover the lesser distance. Now on a four-wheeled bogie or a four-wheeled locomotive, that's relatively straightforward. The outside flanges snug up, the inside flanges move away. But on a 6-wheel or an 8-wheel or a 10-wheel or even in a 12-wheel situation, we need the ability of some of those axle sets to move laterally, such as occurred on the Union Pacific Big Nines, for instance. But in the days prior to that lateral movement, one or two or more of the axle sets in the rigid wheelbase needed to be flangeless, or what were called blind drivers. So back to cornering, when a locomotive hits a curve, it becomes a competition between the force exerted by the rail against that leading outside flange and the weight exerted by the locomotive on that wheel set. And the balance in that relationship determines whether or not a locomotive will corner in a series of shocks, like this example, or corner smoothly, like this example. Now, cornering on a Santa Fe 210-2 back in 1904 required the use of blind drivers. Now, Maud, of course, had 12 coupled wheels, but they were articulated, so blind drivers were not employed. Now, back to the reasoning of the time with respect to that lead truck. That lead engine is powered, it therefore suffers the forces exerted on it by the pistons, and it's worth remembering that Maud was the most powerful locomotive of her day. So that truck cannot operate in a steady state as an unpowered leading truck would do. Now, that wasn't a problem necessarily for Maud because she was conceived as and used as a low-speed locomotive. Hence, on subsequent road types, a leading truck became mandatory, something that the designers of Maud at the time would describe as putting a leading truck in front of a leading truck. You may have noticed that Maud has outside valve gear. This is because the space normally used between the frames was unavailable for the valve mechanism. On the rear engine, this was because of the articulation, the hinge effectively. On the lead engine, it's because the receiver pipe ran down between the frames. You might also have noticed that it's Volschart's valve gear. This is an early example on North American rails. When the type was first used in a New Zealand context, it was also on an articulated locomotive, much smaller, but also for the same reason, that the space between the frames was unavailable. Another factor in choosing Volschart's is that Stephenson's is not well suited for use outside the frames. Stephenson's is also a much heavier mechanism, and with the power developed by Maud, that would have required more dynamic weight to be counterbalanced in a low-drivered locomotive. So a couple of reasons there perhaps. If we look at the valves themselves, we can see the use of cylinder valves on the rear engine and slide valves on the lead engine. Maud was a high-pressure locomotive, therefore her steam was at a higher temperature, therefore the lubrication demands in the high-pressure valves were greater than many of her contemporaries, and lubrication is easier to achieve in a high-temperature environment if you use cylinder valves. On the lead engine, a low-pressure, therefore low-temperature environment, the cheaper-built slide valves were used. The question of temperature of the steam also relates back to why it was that Maud and many of her contemporaries were not superheated. Superheating technology was well understood in 1904, but the lubricants of the time were animal-based, effectively tallow. And tallow could not work in the much higher temperature environment created by superheated steam. So when we do see the widespread introduction of superheating, we are also seeing contemporaneous with it the widespread introduction of mineral lubricants. The flexibility in the steam pipe is standard Mallet technology of the day. Now, I as a child could not figure out how on earth that could occur with only one joint. It turns out that Mr. Mallet and the engineers at Alco and B&O had a much more advanced take on engineering than I did as a 12-year-old. They use 3 joints, swivel joint here and here and a telescoping joint between them. The fact that there are so many joints in what otherwise would be a rigid steam pipe also informs the decision to have the low pressure engine as the flexible leading engine. Much easier to keep things steam tight in a low pressure environment. As far as compounding goes, the only real difference between Maud and the other types of compounding I've discussed is the obvious one, that her low and high pressure engines are separate and distinct, rather than concentrated together on one rigid wheel set. The other big difference is that the receiver is much longer and therefore of a much greater capacity and therefore better suited to take care of the pressure irregularities that occur when the locomotive is out working hard on the road. The use of compounding in an articulated context also comes with a significant advantage if one of the engines loses adhesion and goes into a slip. Most commonly, this would be the lead engine because of the nature of the articulation. The lead engine tends to carry less weight than the trailing engine. And I can illustrate this with a locomotive that needs no introduction, albeit it is a 4-cylinder simple, but it is still a good illustration of an asymmetric slip. So what happens in a compound context is this. The front engine goes into a slip, it quickly exhausts the steam in the receiver, and it quickly runs out of power. It has to wait for the high pressure engine to recharge the receiver before it can generate effort again. And the upshot is also that the tractive effort, instead of falling away to nil, falls away to about 50%. If the trailing engine goes into a slip, which for the reasons I've already set out is less likely to happen, it quickly overfills the receiver, therefore creates an abundance of back pressure that therefore dampens down the spinning of the driving wheels. It may be that in a compound articulated context where one of the engines hits a slip, the driver won't even need to manipulate the regulator to get things back in control. The nature of the relationship between the two engines will take care of it. One last point with respect to Maud. Her firebox is wide, but it's also shallow. Shallow fireboxes are something that bedeviled articulated types through to the end of their development. Nearly all of them had fireboxes that in part were carried above the rear driving wheels. The only exception is the Allegheny, where the entirety of the wide and deep firebox was carried by the massive trailing truck. All right, there's a quick look at the foundation of compound articulators in a massive scale on North American roads. Hope it made sense. Like, subscribe, enjoy. Cheers.